Lammy, at the end of our last conversation, you asked about the challenges. We talked about the challenges that face players. We talked about what challenges we want in a game, what challenges make us excited, and frankly, what challenges might bore us. But what challenges are there for the developer of a game? This is obviously a question that I'm grappling with as a newbie developer. But I wanted to ask you, as a non-game developer, as a developer of other things, what are the challenges? What are the challenges of learning how to do this work? What are the challenges of the work itself? What are the challenges of being with other developers or being alone in development? Like, what are the things that, what are the obstacles in your path, and how do you get around them?
That's a big question. Um, and I think I'll probably just start by answering it the way that makes the most sense and what's on my head right now. Um, with, I guess, some of the challenges at work that I'm seeing now, being at a new company, I would say that a challenge for development that I've come across many times in my career is not understanding the entire scope of the problem you're trying to solve. That often is one of the biggest challenges, not understanding all of the implications of what you're working on. Um, I'm trying to sum up as many different problems into one thing, but I think that that largely encompasses a lot of issues that developers face. Whether that's not having the best requirements up front for what the thing you're working on is supposed to do or how it's supposed to behave, or whether it's you do have the right requirements and you think you know the implications based on your current state of the project you're working on, but then you actually start working and you realize that all the assumptions you had or the way that you thought you would implement it, or the pieces, the other pieces that you thought it would affect, was all off. And that, in fact, you kind of have to start over, at least in thinking and designing the solution to a problem. I think that um, intuitively, when you start out, you know, people don't do a lot of design or planning, especially with programming. They'll kind of just go. It's the, you know, trial and error. You just start doing something and see how it shakes out, right? Work through the problems as they come up. The more senior you sort of get in development, the more upfront planning you sort of do, and you design a lot of your implementation without ever necessarily digging into the code and starting to do anything. But the difficulty there that I'm getting at is that it's kind of hard to know all of the caveats and little things about what you're doing without first digging into the code at least a little bit. So I think, yeah, that's the biggest challenge.
You mentioned scope, which is really important here. Are we also talking about mission creep, where the scope of the project doesn't actually encompass, or it should encompass what we're trying to do, but that scope gets nudged out and out and out before the project gets out of control? Is that a problem in your experience?
It is a problem, but I don't think that it's a problem that's unique to developers. So I meant more the scope creep that happens because of your lack of understanding of the systems and implications of the changes you're thinking of doing to
Right.
make something work. So that kind of scope creep, which is not the scope creep coming from up above or from, oh, but it would be so cool if we also did this, or what if it, you know, it's more like you were told to make this small change. You go, oh, yeah, sure, small change. You go in there and you go, oh, funny story. That small change actually is going to impact all of these other things in this way that we totally didn't know was going to happen. And now there's scope creep because we have to look into, are those changes okay to those other things? We have to maybe talk to other teams or figure that out. And if they're not, how do we change? You know, maybe we've discovered in making one small change, we've discovered an underlying problem with the way it was originally designed. It's like, okay, so is it within the scope of this project to go fix that other thing that actually maybe is blocking the small change? That kind of scope creep that comes more from the development side as opposed to straight from the feature or requested kind of feature side. Um, I mean, scope creep is definitely a problem, but I think it's a problem outside of development. I think it's just a problem that humans deal with because they always want to do more than they're actually capable of.
Well, it's funny. You're talking about scope creep that can happen, or mission creep, or whatever we want to call it, that can happen within a team, but sometimes it happens within a team of one. So Jason Schreier's book Blood, Sweat, and Pixels is really interesting. It's a series of about a dozen chapters, each one dealing with the development of a different game, of a particular game. One of the games actually was never released. It was a Star Wars game, I think Star Wars 1414 or something. I'm not sure if that's the exact number, but anyways, each game, how was it developed? What were the incredible pressures that occurred along the way? What were the lessons learned? And one of them is about Stardew Valley, famously developed by one guy over something like 5 years, and the
Mm-hmm.
debates that he had with himself, and how this wasn't supposed to be a 5 year mega project that sucked up all of his time, gave him no money, where he had to rely on his wife to support him through it, but eventually came out with something that was beautifully nurtured and continues to be a really popular game for anyone who wants to relax while farming, essentially, on a computer screen. But what's interesting is that that story is essentially him realizing, well, I've got to do this and I've got to try this. And he was very public about the development of that game. He had a newsletter that people subscribed to. And this idea of the project kind of getting run away from you happens for just individuals sitting at their computer. And I'm not saying that necessarily it's bad, because in that case, because it was lovingly crafted over 5 years instead of just one, it wasn't an experiment. It became a real thing. It wasn't just, I'm going to try this for a while and then put it away. This was something that became something, a proper game. And many games don't make it through the development hell. So in a way, the mission creep of that game saved it from being nothing. Whereas in other cases, the mission creep makes it something that is totally undoable. And I know for me that that's a problem, because I don't have the experience to set my parameters. I also know that I can let things get carried away with me from me creatively. Whether it's, I was talking about this today in a newsletter that I sent out about over preparing, about doing too much work in advance on something, and then kind of getting caught to catch up with that. If I'm, for example, going to prepare the mechanics of 10 levels in a game, well, then I've got 10 levels to do rather than just one or two, or however we want to look at this. So it's certainly something that I'm grappling with, but again, don't have the experience to contend with. What you're talking about is a mismatch often of, the skills or understanding with what the job requires. And I'm totally in that position as well, obviously. Um, but I would hope that at some point I'm not just one person in a room doing my own thing. I'd like to either be part of something bigger, bring other people in, whatever it is, so that I'm not just pecking away and getting myself in trouble in the ways that we're talking about right now. Um, when you think about development, just the challenge of development as a job, as a day-to-day thing, what are the challenges for you from day to day? So it's the inverse of the question to someone. Instead of what field do you want to be in, what would you like to do day to day for someone who's looking to figure out their career? Do you want to travel a lot? Do you want to sit at a desk? Do you want to work outside? The inverse of that is this, which is, with what you're already doing, what do you find challenging in the day-to-day grind of it?
I find it challenging to stay, like, there's the writer's block aspect, and I think maybe we discussed it before. I don't know if it was actually in an episode or not. um, but even with code, I find there's a bit of, if I'm not really inspired to write code, it could be quite kind of painful. um, and personally, I find, so I was talking about how the further you get on in your career, you end up designing more upfront, and then actually implementation, like actually writing of the code, is almost nothing. Like, you know exactly what you're going to do, and it's almost just the last step of, like, you've literally writing the syntax, and that can be for me quite boring. Because the parts that I find interesting are the solutioning, figuring out, what the solution should be. And so I struggle sometimes, because I'd rather just get into the code and solution that way, because then writing the code is not a trivial, boring kind of almost data entry task, right? When you've designed everything and written out what it should be, and then you're literally just data entry, data entry in this case being actually typing on your keyboard in the same way as with maybe writing would be. But I think that inspiration and creativity, in the same way as you would get for writer's block, both the challenges of that I experience as well, where there's times where I just don't really feel like writing code, But there's the opposite times where I get that inspiration and creativity and forget everything else in life and can just go straight for 10 hours without noticing, without eating, without, because you're solving a problem, and the second you stop, you will lose your place. It reminds me a lot of, if you're in the middle of solving like a math problem or a logic problem, you really can't stop, because you're going to have to start over from the beginning. You're not going to be able to kind of catch your spot exactly, especially when you're thinking really hard about something. And that can be difficult, because therefore distractions, when that's the kind of work that you're doing, really set you back. And not having a large enough chunk of time to start something is another challenge that I deal with, where it feels like if I only have even 1 hour, 1 hour doesn't let me dig into a hard problem. It might let me do a little bit of rote work here and there, or research into something, which is very important and needs to happen. But the parts that I love, which is the true problem solving aspects and like digging into what potential solutions there are, it feels like you need a certain amount of time, because otherwise, that if you get interrupted, it's just really frustrating. Besides the fact that it sometimes feels like time lost, it's also just, it feels frustrating to be where you feel like you're close to figuring something out and you have to stop because you have another meeting, or whatever it might be.
Does development work for you ever resemble what it's like to be in the flow state of a game? So for me, for example, I could play a game and a whole day could go by in what feels like a few minutes. You glance up at the clock, how did that 3 hours go by so quickly? It's almost a joke amongst gamers about how quickly this happens. Going to school or work, how does 2 minutes feel like 2 weeks? But playing a game 2 weeks feels like 2 minutes. Does development work ever feel as close to that, or exactly like that when you're doing it?
Definitely. I think both in a good and a bad way. If there's a deadline coming up and you wish time would slow down because you have too much to do, time could be flying by and you can feel like, no, 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 it's getting away from you. Or if it's just good and you're in that inspiration, you can definitely get into a flow state. Um, I'm not somebody that loses track of time very easily. Like I had been for a lot of my life a very punctual person, struggling more with that in recent years. But I estimate time quite well overall. And like I'm not, and I think it's just some people just really, you could ask them what time do they think it is, and they just will have no idea, right? Like they're just out of time and place. And I'm not one of those people. So flow state for me is actually something that probably should happen more in my life. Like I'm probably missing that being in the moment, meditative kind of state. And it does happen for sure with development. I have experienced it where, like I've said, it's mostly things like, oh my goodness, it's been 3 hours and I haven't even sat up. Like I haven't, which normally I'm getting up at least once an hour. So it does happen, but I would say maybe less for me, just because of who I am, not because of what development is. I think a lot of people do experience flow state with development.
Does it happen when you play games?
I would say it's about the same. Well, we're not really like,
Hmm.
um, yeah, and maybe we've talked about this before too, but I'm not somebody that usually plays games for very long periods of time. Like I know people can get lost and just play a game for hours and hours and hours. I really tap out. Like I think we talked about that in one of the
We
first
did, yeah.
ones, that an hour is very common, and then up to 3. And usually I will feel exhausted if I've played 3 hours straight of something, which then becomes, I obviously am not really entering that flow state. I'm very aware of the fact that I've been doing this activity for a while. There are definitely games that I want to play and that I'm thinking about, but there's still an exhaustion that comes from just, and maybe it's just staring at a screen and thinking, right? A lot of the games that we both like to play, you're doing a lot of thinking and it's hard.
Yeah, I mean, going back to our previous conversation about this just for a minute, when I enter into that state, I'm making a trade-off, right? It's not like this wonderful, perfect place where everything is clicking. It's actually a place where I've abandoned a lot of my thinking and abandoned a lot of my and this is typically what happens, abandon a lot of my precision or the totality of my mind to focus on getting one thing. Say, and I keep referring to rewards, but essentially what I mean is to keep that loop going. So if I'm playing a strategy game, to just get to the build the next thing. If I'm playing an RPG, to get to the next level or get to the next encounter, complete this map or arrive at this location, whatever it is, and to continue pushing that up to the next bit without enjoying the place that I'm in currently, right? Without really relishing in that place, because if I do that, I get exhausted very quickly. Uh, but if I play the kind of very narrow focused, straight shooting, get there as fast as I can, that's where I lose track of time. So in a way, the flow state is the antithesis of the total gaming experience. Really, if I'm going to play a game in totality, I'm going to only be able to go for about an hour or two before I feel like I'm tapping out. And so it's an interesting question, both for playing a game but also developing games, because there comes a point at which we have to push through. We have to just keep working. Obviously I experienced that in parts of my life that are not related to game development but are still work. I've got to get the work done. I've got a deadline this evening or on Tuesday, and it doesn't matter that I'm exhausted. It doesn't matter also that I want to abandon certain parts of my brain, because the work also still has to be of a certain quality. And so, I guess we're no longer talking about the challenges of game development, but the challenges of life. But um, there is a certain need for me to be conscious of this to do it well. Because if I just drop in, plug in, and go as fast as I can, I'll eventually burn out and not deliver the quality of work that I need to get by. And so, for you in development, is there a trade off between? I mean, this is maybe a stupid question, but the trade off between getting things done quickly and getting things done well. Or are you the kind of person that just you're a perfectionist and you have to do it well no matter how long it takes, or what?
I mean, I am a perfectionist, and I do scope creep for myself as well in the way that you mentioned, where I think, well, but if I just spend the time to do this, then it'll be a little bit better, and that'll be, And I think I've learned this lesson a little bit in the past few years that, done is better than perfect. That's been going around a lot. And thankfully, I don't struggle too much to complete tasks, because I know that's there's just, people that start a million projects but rarely finish anything. And thankfully, I'm not quite in that camp where I just love starting things, but I don't like finishing them. I do really like finishing a particular project, but I definitely struggle with wanting it to be perfect before I'm willing to put it out there. And I've been learning that, you know, done is better than perfect. And also that, especially when it comes to development, something that I've always been aware of is what you think perfect is might have no bearing in reality, and that it's better to just release quickly and iterate quickly, right? And I've been working in an agile development methodology for almost my entire career. So we iterate on everything. We don't kind of, as much as I say you plan up front, you do plan up front, but you're also doing small chunks at a time instead of getting an entire sort of project description, waiting for everything to be completely and perfectly scoped out, and then only starting work when it's never going to change again, right? Because you've done everything you possibly could. It's a lot more of taking small chunks and going back and improving upon them as needed. And I think that that's really important for developers and for game developers too, because you need that feedback from actual people to know you might have thought you were working towards perfection, and the thing you spent so much time on nobody cares about, or worse, finds it annoying. And it would have been better to just release something and see what people thought of it and get that feedback, and then know where to spend your time better. With games, of course, that's a bit difficult, because really you're just getting that in playtesting. You're not going to get the true feeling until you do release a game. Although we know nowadays everything's releasing in early access and in beta and in alpha. So maybe that's something we could dig into another time, but people certainly have lots of opinions on that.
Yeah, it's fascinating because there's this sort of open source methodology of game development and game creation where I can play a game in early access. I'm not a developer in that game, but my voice can be heard, and I can go into the forums and say all kinds of stuff, and they might listen, they might respond to me. It might even just be a trick of marketing to make me interested in the game, sure, but there does seem to be a bit of a dialogue going on there, and I wonder to what extent that's good or bad for the developers. If it's just more work, and also if creativity is inhibited by that. Sometimes being creative means I have to go away, either seclude myself or seclude my team away from other people to work together towards something that, again, is nurtured and crafted uh, almost with disrespect to the outside, so that we can give the outside something new, something they didn't expect, something that they maybe don't like at first. It's almost like the album that's released that at first you're like, what is this? But you listen to it a few more times, and before you know it, it's the best thing you've ever heard. But it wasn't the best thing you've ever heard when you first heard it. It became that through your exposure to it. And sometimes the best things are the things that at first are actually bad. They're off-putting. I can remember seeing plays that in the first 10 or 15 minutes I thought, what is this? It doesn't make any sense. But what it was doing was asking me to step into a reality that I wasn't used to yet. And at first that's going to be uncomfortable. But when I step in, it could be life-changing. And I think games are the same thing. For you, if you were to imagine for a second developing something, and you can imagine whatever it is that you're developing, and you've got a team, when you're building your team to get something done, would you follow instinct to do that? Or would you be more analytical and think about who's who, what are their Myers-Briggs personality type, for example? How do they pair? How are they going to fit into my needs, whatever? Where would you go on that axis of instinct versus analysis?
Honestly, in terms of team, it's just who would I want to work with? That's the only thing that matters to me. Um, is who is easy to work with and matches who matches if we had to work together. So I think there's this aspect of if I have to actively work with somebody, I want to know. It would be similar questions as finding out if somebody would be a good roommate. I would have to think about the kinds of interactions I have with this person and uh, figure out if they fit in the team. I do think it's important. Oh, it's hard to answer because I think I'm a very analytical person, but in many ways I do follow my intuition. My intuition, though, has been built up on many years of being analytical about the world.
Right.
So it's in some ways it's really hard to answer because I do think that I trust my intuition a lot, but I trust it because I feel like it's logical and based in rational analysis. So I don't know. It's a tough one to specifically answer. I do look for a balance. I think there's two ways to go about it. Either you have a team where everybody is so cohesive and they're so similar in the way that they work together that it works because everyone's going to get along, right? If everyone's loud and talks over each other, that's good in some ways because there isn't going to be, a smaller percentage of people that aren't being heard or aren't being listened to or feel talked over because they just have a different personality type. So I think kind of the worst thing you could do is have a mix where it's 80% of something and 20% of something else, let's say, because usually what just happens is all of your big personalities will just completely bowl over the smaller ones. But I think it's equally important to have different viewpoints on a team if you're going to make a good product, whatever that product is. It's just tough sometimes to balance. And I think that in my experience, normally most teams aren't a lot of big personalities. There are a couple of big personalities, and the majority of people are usually more reserved. And that can work quite well because I think the bigger personalities learn their place a little bit and can still function within that space. But people like on a team, that is a big challenge for sure to overcome. And making sure that you are covering all your bases. It's something I've never had to fully do. I've never had to assemble a team
Yeah, no, I understand that. I was more thinking like, what would your when you think about working with other people, is it instinctive or analytical or both or somewhere in the middle or one leading to the other? Um, when if you think about your work, like to what extent do you like working, doing your own tasks and reporting back to a team versus working side by side or in tandem with another person or with a group of people? Like, where are you on that spectrum?
I think I'm somewhere in the middle. I like, if I'm stuck, I definitely find it useful to rubber duck and to talk it out with somebody else. Um, and maybe more so than most developers, where the stereotype is that they're kind of antisocial. And, a lot of developers hate pair programming, for example. I think pair
Well,
programming, where you're both sitting essentially side by side and coding at the same time, can be difficult and slow things down in some ways. But I don't think I hate that concept as much as a lot of developers do. I don't want to waste time though. And sometimes by coming together, you can reach a point where you feel like you're kind of just spinning. And at that point, I just want to be like, I'm just going to go off for a bit, think it through on my own, and see if that shakes anything loose. I think it's a mix. I think it depends where you're stuck. You can get stuck in that group place, and then I think I would just go, okay, I need to go off on my own for a bit. I can get stuck on my own and really feel like the only way to get unstuck is to talk it out with somebody else, get somebody's eyes on it. And I definitely prefer meetings, like talking things out rather than writing them. I take a long time to write, and I don't think very well in writing, so that's a difficulty for me.
I think also for me, I'm lazy in writing. Not sorry, I'll be clear. If there's a long email exchange or series of email exchanges about a subject, I'm going to get lazy. I'm not going to read them. I'm going to do the Coles notes and summarize things or skip that chain or whatever, but then write an email that is just based on what I think in that moment about the very few things that I have read and just send it off and hopefully things happen. I get lazy. Whereas if I'm in a room, I'm not lazy. I'm paying attention, I'm listening, I'm in the group of people. But at the same time, there's the trade off of we could spend 2 hours in here of a group of people. And in those 2 hours times 8 people is 16 hours of actual work that could be getting done.
Mm-hmm.
That can be really frustrating. I think another problem that I have is I can be very stubborn on my own. So I certainly get stuck in a group of people, and like pair programming gives me nightmares, waking nightmares right now. I've got images in the back of my head of like, oh my God, that sounds awful. Like, can I just turn my screen away and do my own thing and we'll just talk in 10 minutes? Like, I like coming back to the group, but so I get stuck that way. But when I'm on my own and I go off and I get stuck, I don't come back. I don't ask for advice. I don't talk to other people. I just push through and push through and push through. And sometimes when the deadline is loose or the project is more ephemeral, I just lose the thread rather than coming back and asking for support or advice. I don't know if that's a pride thing, a personality trait, or what it is, but I guess it is literally antisocial. Like I'm opposed to the social solution, and yeah, I'd have to investigate that further. But granted, if we continue on this conversation, it will become another psychological analysis of the two of us. But we've already mentioned Myers Briggs. Do you know your personality type, by the way?
Yeah, I used to, maybe unsurprisingly, I used to always get INTJ when I was
Same.
younger. Really, the exact
Yeah.
same. That's really
Yeah.
funny. I think I'm a bit more, it's really hard for me to take those tests because growing up in a household with a psychologist, it was very obvious, like what, how I should answer. Like I could, you couldn't answer honestly because you knew what the question was getting at. And so I've always felt like, how can you not be biased in answering your own Myers Briggs? And I think I've always had a very strong personality, and that hadn't changed very much for most of my life. So it's not surprising that it stayed INTJ. But now I find that it can change quite a bit when I take it. So I don't even know what it would be now. I think it's a bit more in flux as I grow up and find out exactly who I am. But how do you feel about your INTJ role?
Well, it's interesting because and this is a bit of a tangent here, but I did the test. I had a calm class. It was in Alberta, so career and life management. And as part of that class, we all learned about Myers-Briggs, and we all did the personality test as a way to understand what you should do with your life and what career you should have. And I was INTJ. And I wonder now if whether or not that test was accurate at the time, if I've then lived up to the expectations of being an INTJ. If that, because I was 15, 16 years old, I was still malleable. I could be molded into something different. Have I lived my life according to that definition in the same way that someone named Smith is more likely to be a blacksmith, not because it's in their blood or anything, but because there's almost an idea of living up to something. It's the power of names and the power of saying to someone, you're going to be a firefighter. If you say it to them enough when they're 10 years old, they might just well become a firefighter or want to. And so, yeah, I wonder. But if I think about it now, it feels completely accurate. The only letter in that, so it's INTJ, introverted versus extroverted. The N, and I think it's S, so like intuitive versus sensory, thinking versus feeling, T or F, and then judging versus perceiving. All of those make sense. The only one that is maybe close to the middle is my introverted versus extroverted. Like, I'm not a complete introvert. I really enjoy my time alone. I'm happy to go off in a cabin for a weekend all by myself. I did that when my wife had her bachelorette party, and I've had people look at me like I have 7 heads. Like, you went off into, I was a yurt for a whole weekend by yourself, and I'm like, yeah, it was one of my favorite weekends of my life. It was fantastic. I wrote, I walked, I don't know, I just enjoyed being by myself. But I'm not wholly there. I enjoy other people. I don't like loud crowds and groups of people. But anyways, it seems to fit for me. They say that INTJs are contingency planners, and that makes perfect sense for how I think about problems. I'm never thinking about just A and B. I'm going to C, D, E, and F to my own fault, because all that matters sometimes is A. And me spending time on E, F, G, H, I, J is really wasteful. Done is better than perfect, like you said.
Well, I had another question, and short one that maybe will also help in illuminating how you've been going about learning to be a game developer as well. But what kind of learning do you usually like? So you talked about how you can get lazy when it comes to writing and like reading a long email chain or all that. What is your preferred method of taking in information or learning? Like in school, were you paying attention in class or studying a lot at home or both? Or what kind of way do you like to take in information?
I did pay attention in class. It was pretty easy for me. Audio material is very easily digested, so I can listen to I go for a walk every morning. I walk my dog, and I'm listening to either an audiobook or a podcast, and I'm really listening to it. When I go for long drives, same thing. And I only wish that I could have a notepad or something to write things down. I'm digesting it quite well. I'm learning it. I don't know if I'm learning it as well as when I read, because when I'm actually reading a book, I go through the same paragraph. There's a certain train that's left the station. Yeah, I can pause an audiobook, but I don't want to.
Mm-hmm.
There's a barrier to that. There's friction there. I don't want to pause it, so I'm just going to let it keep going, and I'll miss that little bit. When I'm reading, I'm going to reread, especially if it's at a part that's changing the way I look at things. But like visuals, graphics, stuff like that, films to teach me something, less so. And then I used to think I learned a lot just by having conversations with people, the question and answer. I
Mm-hmm.
think certainly when I was younger, I got a lot out of that. Um, but one thing I know I don't do well is learning by doing, which is, I know that sounds terrible, but, and I guess I'm going back to being a teenager, but when I had to learn something through a lab experiment, learning how chemicals interact by actually putting them in a bottle and interacting, I was a complete moron. I had no idea what's going on. Could I just please read the piece of paper and I'll remember that? But like having to actually hold it in my hands or open something up, and no, I honestly really struggled with that kind of learning, with practical learning, which has probably gotten me in trouble in my learning life many times. Uh, yeah. What about you?
Just for no reason whatsoever. Are you a handy man?
I've had to become so, but I'm not naturally. No. I've like when we get furniture, I'm okay at putting it together. I can hold a screwdriver and a drill. I do know what those things are. I've even when I traveled across Africa about 7 years ago, and I had to learn because I just had to how to fix basic things on a car. I'm not a mechanic. I will never be a mechanic. I could never be a mechanic. It's just not natural for me. Um, yeah, so I would say by virtue of necessity, I'm okay with that stuff, but it's not natural for me.
Just because you said you don't, you weren't learning by doing, and it sounded
Yeah.
like your struggle came from the physicality of it, which is why I
Not just
was
the
wondering.
physicality, I think by the variety of it. Like if you're dissecting a rabbit, for example, I don't know why that's an example, but okay, dissecting a rabbit. Well, rabbits can come in different shapes and sizes. When there's a rabbit on a page of a book, it's the same rabbit in every book that I'm seeing. There's no variation. I know what it is. It's given to me right there. But this rabbit right here, it's the bone's not in the place that it says it is in the book, and it just screws me up. And
Oh,
so I think it might be the variety. The
right.
physicality I'm okay with. I'm not afraid of holding things or doing things physically. It's more I think it's a mental blockage.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, some similarities there, because I would have said number one was audio. The way I got through all of school was that for whatever reason I focused in class and paid attention, and that's all I had to do. That was good enough. And I know that even other friends of mine who got just as good of grades or even better, even they wouldn't necessarily be able to keep a focus as much in class and pick up as much as they needed, and they were much better at studying and going home and reading textbooks. And I struggled with that because as much as I was a voracious reader through school, I didn't really like learning through reading. Like it was just an entertainment source. I definitely got into flow state while reading. That was something that would happen
Right.
for me, and it didn't mean that I was retaining the information very well from it. I would retain the feeling that it gave me. And I think the main themes that we're getting across, which works very well for fiction books, doesn't work very well for textbooks because that's not really the way what you're supposed to be getting out of it. So I would read, but yeah, the number one way was definitely just listening, being told, like you said, a conversation or something works well. But I did like tactical and practical and doing it myself. And I know that they've said since that actually there's no real such thing as a visual learner or an auditory learner or any of that. That idea is flawed. And the truth is that we all learn best when all of those senses are
Yeah.
engaged.
Yeah, and that makes sense for me. Lammy, to finish us off now, is there anything that we churned up from the tangential trawler of our conversation in the last 40 minutes or so that you'd like to dig into more, maybe when we next meet?
I would love to chat more. Well, there's been two things. One is I think we could chat a little bit more about flow state, especially when it comes to video games. And there's tons of games out there that try to induce flow state, like Tetris, Tetris Effect. Huge, huge game for that. But also, I do think it would be interesting to chat sometime about early access games and what does that mean for the video game world, and how do you feel about it, and what place do releasing games that aren't finished um, have in our world. So either one of those topics. I also know that soon we are going to be talking maybe about Outer Wilds.
Yes,
So
soon. Not right away, but soon. Yeah.
okay, let me know. I'm in the same boat. I haven't even. You've probably at least booted it up. I haven't booted it up yet.
Okay,
So
but come on, we could talk about it right now, and you'd have 3 hours of material or more. I'm not worried about you booting it up. I'm the one that needs to play the damn thing.
yes, but I also I it was a joint challenge because I had been having difficulties playing the DLC. So I would feel like I didn't hold up my it's not about not having lack of things to talk about. It's just that I was supposed to go and play the thing that I've been having a barrier getting back into.
That's true. I just think that if we were to both fake it, you'd be more convincing than me. Because you'd come and pretend that you'd done the DLC, and I'd be like, what is in the DLC? And I would come and say, so I explored a lot, and I was on a spaceship, and I had to move it around. I found things that's all I've got, honestly. So maybe I do need to play it soon.
Sounds
Uh,
good.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm really excited to talk about the early access issue because I think that has wider cultural connotations too in other things that we consume in our entertainment pantheon, about bringing the audience in too much too early. There's a risk there to the artist, I think. Okay. See you next time.
See you next time.